Picture this. It's 1859, and Mrs. Whitmore walks into her doctor's office complaining of anxiety, insomnia, and irritability. What does her highly respected physician prescribe? Not pills, not rest, not therapy, but manual genital stimulation performed right there on his examination table. And here's the kicker. This wasn't some underground scandal or medical malpractice. This was standard, respectable medical treatment that millions of women received for over 70 years, and the doctors performing it had absolutely no idea they were giving their patients orgasms. Before we dive into this absolutely wild story that sounds like it came straight out of a fever dream, I need you to understand just how massive this medical mystery was. We're talking about a treatment that was so widespread that up to 75% of American women were diagnosed with the condition it was meant to cure. We're talking about an entire medical industry worth $18 million by 1915. That's $450 million in today's money, built around doctors unknowingly providing sexual satisfaction to their female patients while being completely oblivious to what they were actually doing. This isn't some small historical footnote. This is one of the most bizarre and massive medical phenomena in human history, and somehow, most people have never heard about it. The story begins way before the Victorian era, stretching back over 2,000 years to ancient civilizations that created one of the most ridiculous medical theories ever conceived, the wandering womb. Picture ancient Egyptian and Greek physicians scratching their heads trying to figure out why women experienced certain symptoms, and their brilliant conclusion was that the female reproductive system was essentially a restless animal living inside women's bodies. Hippocrates, the so-called father of medicine, has named this condition hysteria, after the Greek word hystera, meaning uterus, because he genuinely believed that the uterus would literally wander around inside a woman's body like some kind of internal nomad, causing havoc wherever it decided to settle. But wait, it gets even more ridiculous. Plato described the uterus as an animal within an animal that was desperate for children and would become restless and angry if it wasn't satisfied with pregnancy. According to this ancient wisdom, when the uterus didn't get what it wanted, babies, it would start traveling through the woman's body, pressing against her lungs, heart, and brain, causing everything from breathing problems to emotional disturbances. The original cure was beautifully simple in its ignorance. Get married and have children to keep that wandering womb happy and in its proper place. Now here's where things start getting really interesting, because as we move through history, you'd think medical science would evolve and leave these ridiculous theories behind, right? Wrong. By the Renaissance, doctors had mostly abandoned the idea of the physically wandering womb, but they held on to the hysteria diagnosis with a death grip and actually made it worse by expanding what it could supposedly cause. Suddenly, hysteria wasn't just about reproductive issues. It could explain nervousness, insomnia, muscle spasms, appetite loss, and basically any behavior that didn't fit the narrow definition of how women were supposed to act. And here's where it gets truly insane. Anything a woman did could be labeled as hysteria. Too sexually forward? Hysteria. Too sexually repressed? Also hysteria. Too emotional? Hysteria. Not emotional enough? You guessed it, hysteria. It became the ultimate catch-all diagnosis for any woman who didn't perfectly conform to society's expectations. Thomas Sydenham, a prominent physician, claimed that hysteria affected 25% of all women, making it one of the most common medical conditions of the time. Imagine that, 1 in 4 women supposedly suffering from their own reproductive systems rebelling against them. But the real madness hadn't even begun yet, because when we hit the Victorian era, this whole hysteria business reached absolutely unprecedented levels of absurdity. Victorian medicine took the already ridiculous concept and cranked it up to 11 by developing elaborate theories about female physiology that were so far from reality they might as well have been science fiction. Victorian doctors believed that women were inherently delicate, nervous creatures whose entire physiology was controlled by their reproductive systems. They saw women as these fragile beings who were constantly on the verge of collapse due to the overwhelming influence of their wombs on every aspect of their health. Dr. William Acton, one of the most influential physicians of the time, genuinely believed and taught other doctors that the majority of women are not troubled with sexual feeling of any kind. Think about that for a second. Here's a man who dedicated his career to medicine, who was supposed to understand human physiology, confidently declaring that women simply didn't experience sexual desire. This wasn't just ignorance. This was willful blindness on a massive scale. The Victorian medical establishment had created this bizarre alternate reality where women were simultaneously controlled by their reproductive systems, but completely devoid of sexual feelings. This created the perfect storm of medical stupidity because when women came to doctors with symptoms that we now know were often related to sexual frustration, stress, or just normal human emotions, the doctors saw only disease. They couldn't recognize sexual frustration because they refused to acknowledge that women had sexual needs in the first place. It was like being a mechanic who doesn't believe cars need fuel and then being baffled when engines won't run properly. So what was the solution these brilliant medical minds came up with? Pelvic massage designed to induce what they called hysterical paroxysm. And here's where we need to pause and really appreciate the incredible irony of what was happening, because these doctors developed an entire clinical vocabulary to describe what they were doing without ever acknowledging what they were actually doing. They would place women on examination tables, use scented oils, and perform circular massage techniques on the genital area until the patient experienced what Dr. Nathaniel Highmore described as violent contractions accompanied by flushing of the skin and immediate relief of all hysterical symptoms. Let me paint you a picture of just how clinical and professional these doctors thought they were being. They would schedule regular appointments, sometimes weekly or bi-weekly, where women would come in, lie on examination tables, and receive what the doctors considered purely medical treatment. The physicians would use specific techniques, applying circular pressure and stimulation until the patient reached what they called the therapeutic climax of hysterical paroxysm. The women would experience muscle contractions, flushing, rapid breathing, and then sudden relaxation and relief from their symptoms. The doctors would carefully document these responses in their medical journals as evidence of successful treatment. But here's the thing that makes this whole situation even more unbelievable. This treatment could take over an hour to complete, and the doctors complained about how tedious and physically demanding it was. Dr. Russell Trawl actually wrote that pelvic massage was the most fatiguing and demanding procedure in medical practice, and that it caused severe hand cramping and fatigue. These physicians were literally complaining about how exhausting it was to manually stimulate women to orgasm, while having no idea that's what they were doing. They saw it as a boring, repetitive medical procedure rather than anything sexual. The scale of this practice is absolutely mind-blowing when you really think about it. We're not talking about a few isolated cases or some fringe medical practice. This was mainstream medicine. Some doctors built their entire careers around treating hysteria patients. Dr. Taylor in New York had such a booming hysteria practice that he had to hire multiple physicians just to meet the demand. Women were scheduling regular appointments and maintaining treatment relationships with their doctors for years, sometimes decades. Wealthy women could even arrange for house calls where doctors would bring their medical equipment to provide private treatments in the comfort of their own homes. And just when you think this story couldn't get any weirder, along comes hydrotherapy, which took the whole situation to an entirely new level of unintentional absurdity. Spa treatments became incredibly popular, with specialized facilities offering what they called water cure treatments that involved directing high-pressure jets of water at women's genital areas while they sat in specially designed chairs with cutout seats. European destinations like Bath in England and Baden-Baden in Germany became famous for these treatments, with women traveling from all over the world to receive what the French elegantly termed la douche pelvienne, the pelvic shower. These spa treatments turned the whole hysteria cure into a luxury experience. Women would spend weeks at these facilities, receiving multiple treatments per day, staying in beautiful accommodations, and socializing with other women who were there for the same medical reasons. The marketing was absolutely shameless. Facilities promised complete restoration of feminine vitality and advertised their treatments as the ultimate cure for all forms of female nervousness and reproductive disorders. Imagine the conversations these women must have had, comparing notes on their treatments while having no socially acceptable way to discuss what was actually happening to them. But the real game changer came when Dr. Joseph Mortimer Granville looked at his cramped, aching hands after performing countless manual treatments and thought, "There has got to be a better way." This brilliant man invented the first electric vibrator, which he called the percussor, using an electric motor to create rapid vibrations that could achieve the same therapeutic results in minutes rather than hours. Granville had no idea he was creating what would become one of the most significant innovations in human sexual satisfaction. He just wanted to make his medical practice more efficient. The impact was immediate and revolutionary. Suddenly, doctors could treat multiple patients per day instead of spending hours on each case. The treatment that once required over an hour of exhausting manual labor could now be completed in just a few minutes with the flip of a switch. But here's where the story takes an even more incredible turn. The vibrator market absolutely exploded, and by the 1890s, there were dozens of different models available for medical use. The Weiss Company catalog of 1906 listed over 20 different vibrator models, each designed for specific medical applications. But the most shocking development was how quickly these devices moved from doctors' offices into American homes. By 1900, the electric vibrator had become the fifth most common electrical appliance in American households, more popular than electric fans, toasters, or vacuum cleaners. Sears was advertising vibrators in their family catalog right alongside sewing machines and kitchen appliances, marketed for home service and personal health maintenance. The advertising for these devices was simultaneously explicit and completely proper, which shows you just how deep the cultural blindness ran. Companies used slogans like "Vibration is life" and promised that their products could provide the essence of life itself while maintaining complete medical respectability. The White Cross electric vibrator was advertised as bringing perfect health through perfect vibration, and families could order these devices from respectable catalogs without any sense that they were purchasing sexual aids. What makes this whole situation even more unbelievable is the complete and total ignorance of the medical establishment about what they were actually doing. We're talking about doctors who had spent years studying anatomy, physiology, and medical theory, yet somehow remained completely oblivious to the sexual nature of the treatments they were providing. Medical schools of the time barely mentioned female anatomy beyond reproductive functions, and the clitoris was either completely ignored or dismissed as a vestigial organ with no significant purpose. Dr. John Harvey Kellogg presents the perfect example of this incredible cognitive dissonance. This man spent his career crusading against masturbation, writing extensively about the dangers of sexual self-stimulation and developing elaborate methods to prevent it, while simultaneously operating a medical practice where he regularly gave women orgasms as treatment for hysteria. He saw absolutely no connection between the hysterical paroxysms he was inducing and the sexual self-stimulation he was fighting against. The mental gymnastics required to maintain this level of ignorance is truly staggering. The medical literature from this period is filled with detailed clinical descriptions of the paroxysm response, the muscle contractions, the flushing, the rapid breathing, the subsequent relaxation and mood improvement. Yet not a single paper made the connection to sexual climax. These doctors were documenting orgasms in scientific detail, while being completely unable to recognize what they were observing. They created elaborate theories about muscle spasms and nervous system responses, building entire treatment protocols around achieving these therapeutic contractions without ever acknowledging the obvious. But here's what makes this story even more fascinating. Many women clearly understood what was happening, even if they couldn't openly discuss it. Anonymous diary entries from 1892 show women eagerly anticipating their medical appointments and writing in coded language about the peculiar treatment that provided such unique relief. Women created networks, recommending specific doctors to their friends and discussing the effectiveness of different practitioners, all while maintaining the medical fiction that this was purely therapeutic. These women lived in a society that gave them no vocabulary to discuss female sexuality, no acceptable way to acknowledge their own sexual needs. Yet they found ways to access what they needed through the medical system. They scheduled regular appointments, maintained long-term treatment relationships, and clearly experienced significant improvement in their overall well-being, all while participating in this massive cultural charade about what was actually happening. The darker side of this medical ignorance led to some truly horrific consequences. Because doctors couldn't understand female sexuality, they often viewed any signs of sexual awareness or self-stimulation as dangerous pathology that needed to be eliminated. This led to extreme interventions like clitoridectomies, surgical removal of the clitoris, performed on women and girls as young as 10 years old. Dr. Isaac Baker Brown became infamous for these procedures, removing clitorises as a cure for masturbation, while seeing no irony in the fact that he was also providing orgasmic treatments for hysteria in the same practice. The medical establishment eventually expelled Brown from professional societies, but not because they disagreed with the concept of clitoridectomy as treatment. They expelled him for performing surgery without proper consent. The procedure itself was considered medically acceptable. Some doctors used acid cauterization to burn the clitoris, believing this would prevent self-abuse, while continuing to provide manual stimulation treatments for hysteria. The level of medical contradiction and ignorance is almost impossible to comprehend. Meanwhile, the vibrator industry was booming like nothing the medical device market had ever seen. By 1915, the annual earnings from vibrator sales had reached $18 million. That's equivalent to about $450 million today. The devices themselves became increasingly elaborate, with multiple attachments, variable speeds, and specialized features for different types of treatment. The Vibratile of 1908 came with an entire kit of different applicators, while the Pulsicon hand crank model of 1890 was designed for portability and home use. Some manufacturers integrated vibrating mechanisms into furniture, creating treatment chairs and examination tables with built-in vibrating components. The technology advanced rapidly, driven by what manufacturers believed was purely medical demand, never recognizing that they were actually revolutionizing human sexual satisfaction. The marketing materials from this period are absolutely incredible to read today. They promise relief from nervousness, restoration of vitality, and cure for feminine disorders, all while describing devices that were clearly designed for sexual stimulation. But all good things must come to an end, and the beginning of the end for this incredible medical charade came from an unexpected source: Sigmund Freud. Despite all his other controversial theories, Freud made one crucial contribution to ending this madness. He acknowledged that women actually had sexual desires. This revolutionary concept began to filter through the psychiatric community, and doctors slowly started recognizing that many hysteria symptoms might be psychological rather than purely physical. The American Psychiatric Association began moving away from the hysteria diagnosis in the 1920s, but the real death blow came from the emerging pornography industry. When stag films of the 1920s began showing vibrators being used for obviously sexual purposes, the medical community suddenly couldn't maintain their fiction anymore. Devices that had been respectable medical equipment for decades became overnight symbols of sexual impropriety,